The morning mist clung to Tom's cornfields like a death shroud, but nothing could have prepared for what waited by the old oak tree. Deep gouges carved into the ancient bark caught his eye, too precise for a bear, too deliberate for weather. As he approached, his blood turned to ice. These weren't scratches, they were symbols, military symbols he hadn't seen since his classified missions in the Amazon 20 years ago. Tom's hands trembled as memories flooded back. The expedition that was never supposed to exist, the things they'd encountered in those jungle depths, the oath of silence that came with a hefty government pension. He'd thought distance and time had buried those secrets forever. But the symbols carved into his tree told a different story. Something had followed him home. The corn rustled without wind. Strange sounds echoed from the woods, sounds he recognized from nightmares he'd tried to forget. His family was inside the farmhouse, completely unaware that their quiet rural life was about to become a battlefield. But what exactly had Tom encountered in the Amazon all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tom pressed his calloused palm against the rough bark, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns carved deep into the wood. The symbols were fresh, the sap still sticky, the edges sharp enough to draw blood. Someone or something had been here recently, very recently. The first symbol resembled a twisted helix, similar to DNA but wrong somehow, with too many strands and angles that hurt to look at directly. Below it, 3 parallel lines intersected by a circle, the same marking they'd found on the cave walls in the Amazon, painted in what their xenobiologist had insisted was definitely not human blood. A crow cawed overhead, but when Tom glanced up, the sky was empty except for grey clouds rolling in from the west. The sound came again, closer this time, but still no bird in sight. His military training kicked in automatically. Assess the threat, secure the perimeter, protect the assets. In this case, the assets were Sarah and the kids, probably sitting down to breakfast right now, wondering why Dad hadn't come in from his morning rounds. The wind picked up, carrying with it an odor that made Tom's stomach lurch. It was the same smell from the expedition, sweet and metallic, like copper pennies left in honey. Dr. Martinez had theorized it was some kind of pheromone, but she disappeared on day 6, along with her theories and her screams that had echoed through the jungle for hours after the lights took her. Tom forced himself to step back from the tree and survey the surrounding area. The grass was trampled in a pattern that made no sense, not the random crushing of an animal, but deliberate, almost ritualistic circles that spiraled outward from the oak's base. In the center of the largest circle, something glinted in the morning light. He knelt and brushed away the dew-covered leaves. A small metallic disc lay embedded in the earth, its surface covered with the same alien script they'd found in the underground chambers. The disc was warm to the touch, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. When he lifted it, the symbols on the tree began to glow with a faint blue light. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered, dropping the disc as if it had burned him. The device hit the ground and activated something. The air around the oak tree shimmered, and for a brief moment, Tom could see through the distortion to something massive, moving in the woods beyond. Something that shouldn't exist. Something that had followed him across continents and decades to this quiet corner of Iowa. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Sarah asking if he wanted eggs or pancakes. The normalcy of it felt obscene against the backdrop of what was happening in his backyard. How could he explain that their morning breakfast routine was about to be interrupted by the cosmic horror he'd spent 20 years trying to forget? The sound came again, that hollow, echoing cry that wasn't quite animal and definitely wasn't human. It was closer now, maybe 100 yards into the tree line. Tom's hand instinctively went to his hip, searching for a sidearm that hadn't been there since his discharge. Old habits and muscle memory, but no help against what was coming. He needed to get to the house, needed to get his family somewhere safe, needed to make some calls to people who might not even be alive anymore. But first, he had to retrieve that disc. Whatever it was, It was clearly important to them, and anything important to the enemy was valuable intelligence. As Tom reached for the device again, the blue glow from the tree symbols intensified. The morning mist began swirling in unnatural patterns, forming shapes that looked almost like faces, twisted, alien faces, with too many eyes and mouths that moved without sound. Time was running out. The scratches were too deep, too precise. Tom ran his weathered fingers along the gouges in the oak's bark, feeling the wood splinter under his touch. In 30 years of farming this land, he'd seen plenty of bear sign, claw marks on trees where they'd stretched or marked territory. This wasn't that. Each groove was exactly 4 inches long, carved in sets of 3. The spacing was mechanical, deliberate. No animal clawed with such uniformity. The marks started 7 feet up the trunk and descended in parallel lines, as if something had slid down the tree face first. Tom stepped back, his breath misting in the morning air. The oak stood at the edge of his property, where his pasture met the dense pine forest that stretched for miles toward the Canadian border. He'd walked this fence line every morning for 3 decades, checking for breaks, loose wire, anything that might let his cattle wander. He would have noticed these marks before. They were fresh. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, then hesitated. Who would he call? Sheriff Caldwell would think he was losing his mind, reporting mysterious tree scratches like some paranoid old fool. The local wildlife officer might be interested, but Tom already knew this wasn't wildlife. A sound drifted from the forest, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Tom froze, listening. The humming stopped. Silence pressed against him, thick and unnatural. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, no distant highway noise, just the sound of his own breathing and the faint whistle of wind through the oak's bare branches. Something moved in the tree line. Tom squinted into the shadows between the pines. A shape shifted behind the trunks, too tall and angular to be a deer, too quick to be human. His hand instinctively moved to his hip, reaching for a sidearm that hadn't been there for 15 years. "Hello?" he called out, his voice carrying farther than expected in the still air. No response. The shape was gone. Tom's pulse quickened, muscle memory flooding back from a life he'd worked hard to leave behind. In Afghanistan, you learned to trust your instincts. When something felt wrong, it usually was. When the ordinary world suddenly turned quiet and strange, you paid attention. A section of fence post near the oak began to smoke. Tom blinked, certain he was seeing things. But no, grey wisps rose from the metal post where it met the wire. The smoke spread along the fence line in both directions, following the metal like a slow fuse. Where the vapor touched, the grass underneath withered and blackened. His cattle, grazing in the far corner of the pasture, suddenly lifted their heads in unison. They faced the forest, ears forward, bodies rigid with alarm. Then, as one, they bolted toward the barn. 20 head of cattle don't spook without reason. Tom had seen them stand their ground against coyotes, barely lift their heads during thunderstorms. Whatever was out there had triggered every prey instinct they possessed. The lead cow, a massive Holstein named Bessie, reached the barn first. She crowded against Tom, her huge brown eyes rolling white with terror. The others pressed in behind her, breathing hard, their panic filling the space with the smell of fierce sweat and adrenaline. Tom's phone buzzed. A text message from a number he didn't recognize. "We need to talk. Tonight. Old Mill Road. Come alone. M." His blood turned to ice. Only 3 people had ever called him by that initial, and 2 of them were dead. Dr. Marcus Webb had been his handler during the classified operations, the man who'd recruited him for missions that officially never happened. Tom hadn't heard from him in 15 years, not since the program was supposedly shut down. Another message arrived. "They found us. All of us. You're not safe there anymore." The smoking fence post suddenly erupted in blue flame that climbed skyward without heat, without sound. The fire spread along the wire in both directions, racing around the perimeter of his property like a signal flare. Tom stared at the impossible flames and understood with sick certainty that his past hadn't just caught up with him, it had been hunting him. And now it was here. The scratches were too deep. That was Tom's first coherent thought as he crouched beside the massive oak tree, running his weathered fingers along the gouges in the bark. 20 years of farming had taught him the signs of local wildlife, and these marks didn't fit any pattern he recognized. Bear claws would leave parallel lines, usually 4 or 5, depending on the species. These were different. 7 distinct channels carved into the wood, each one nearly an inch deep and perfectly spaced. The spacing bothered him most, too uniform, too deliberate, like something had taken careful aim before striking. Tom pulled out his phone and snapped several photos, then immediately felt foolish for doing so. What was he going to do, post them on social media, ask his neighbors if they'd seen anything unusual? The Hendersons had already started whispering about old Tom Miller losing his grip since Sarah passed. He didn't need to give them more ammunition. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shifting shadows through the canopy above. Tom stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement, and walked around the tree's circumference. More scratches. These were lower, clustered around the base of the trunk, in a pattern that made his chest tighten with unwanted recognition. He'd seen marks like this before, in a place he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. The memory surfaced unbidden, a forward operating base outside Kandahar, 2008. Classified research facility, bodies found in similar patterns of destruction, though the official reports had blamed insurgent attacks with improvised weapons. Tom had been part of the security detail, sworn to secrecy about everything he'd witnessed during those 3 months of deployment. But this was different. This was Iowa. This was his land, his sanctuary, 2,000 miles and 15 years removed from whatever hell they'd been dabbling with in that desert compound. A branch snapped somewhere behind him. Tom spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for a sidearm that hadn't been there since his discharge. The cornfield stretched endlessly in the morning light, row upon row of green stalks swaying in the breeze. Nothing moved except the natural rhythm of the crops. "Getting paranoid in your old age," he muttered, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. He walked back toward the farmhouse, forcing himself to maintain a steady pace despite the urge to run. The familiar weight of his grandfather's Remington waited in the gun cabinet, and Tom found himself calculating the steps needed to reach it. Muscle memory from his military training, patterns of thought he'd hoped were buried forever. Inside, he made coffee with shaking hands and spread the morning paper across the kitchen table without reading it. The ritual helped calm his nerves, but his eyes kept drifting to the window that faced the oak tree. In daylight, it looked innocent enough. Just another tree on just another farm in just another corner of rural America. The phone rang, making him jump. "Tom? It's Sheriff Bradley." The voice was crisp, professional, with an undertone Tom couldn't quite identify. "We need to talk. In person. About what?" A pause. "I'd rather discuss it face to face. I'm about 10 minutes out." The line went dead before Tom could respond. He stared at the receiver, then hung up slowly. Sheriff Bradley was a good man, had been sheriff for nearly a decade, but they'd never been particularly close. Social calls weren't his style. Tom's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, package delivered as requested, terms of contract fulfilled. "Thank you for your service." His blood turned to ice. The phone slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the kitchen table. "Package delivered." Those words transported him instantly back to the briefing rooms and classified corridors of his past, to conversations held in whispers about projects that didn't officially exist. He grabbed the phone and tried to call the number back. Disconnected, of course. Through the window, he could see a dust cloud approaching on the county road. Sheriff Bradley's cruiser, right on schedule. But now Tom was wondering who else might have made that phone call, who else might be monitoring his communications. The gouges on the oak tree suddenly made perfect sense, and Tom Miller realized with horrible clarity that retirement meant nothing to certain organizations. They'd found him. After 15 years of quiet farming, of morning coffee and evening news, and the simple rhythms of rural life, They'd finally come to collect on old debts. He walked to the gun cabinet and removed the Remington, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. Whatever was coming had already announced itself with 7 perfectly spaced scratches in ancient bark. The only question now was whether Tom Miller, veteran farmer and keeper of dangerous secrets, would be ready when it arrived. Outside, Sheriff Bradley's cruiser turned into his driveway, and Tom noticed with growing unease that the sheriff wasn't alone. Tom's hands trembled as he reached for the satellite phone buried deep in his bedroom closet, beneath years of accumulated dust and forgotten memories. The device felt foreign in his weathered palms, a relic from a life he'd worked so hard to leave behind. But the photographs spread across his kitchen table demanded action, and there was only one person who might have answers. The phone crackled to life after 3 agonizing minutes of satellite acquisition. Tom punched in a number he'd memorized but never wanted to use again. Blackwater Communications. The voice was crisp, professional, anonymous. "I need to speak with Colonel Morrison. Tell him Shepard is calling home." The line went silent except for the soft hum of encrypted routing. Tom stared out his kitchen window at the tree line, where shadows seemed to move independently of the wind. His reflection in the glass looked haggard, older than his 58 years. "Jesus Christ, Tom. I thought you were dead." Morrison's voice carried the weight of 2 decades and too many classified operations. "Where the hell have you been? Farming corn and raising cattle in Iowa, living the American dream you promised us." Tom's voice carried a bitter edge. "But I think something from the old days just knocked on my door." "What kind of something?" Tom glanced at the photographs again, those impossibly deep gouges in the oak bark, the strange crystalline residue, the faint luminescence that his camera had somehow captured, the kind that leaves marks 12 feet up an oak tree and glows in the dark. The silence stretched long enough that Tom wondered if the connection had dropped. When Morrison finally spoke, his voice had lost its casual warmth. "Tom, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Are you completely alone on your property?" "Yes." "Nearest neighbor is 3 miles east." "Good. Don't contact anyone else. Not local police, not animal control, nobody. I'm sending a team to extract you within 48 hours. "Extract me?" Tom's grip tightened on the phone. "Morrison, what the hell is going on? What did we really encounter in that jungle 20 years ago? You know I can't discuss operational details over an open line." "Bullshit. I'm not some green recruit anymore. Whatever that thing was in Colombia, it's here now, on my land. And I have a right to know what I'm dealing with." Morrison's sigh carried across the encrypted connection like static. Project Prometheus was supposed to be terminated. Every specimen was supposed to be destroyed. The words hit Tom like ice water. "Specimen? You told us it was a rescue mission. American hostages." "There were hostages, Tom. But that wasn't the primary objective." Morrison's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The locals called it El Cazador de Luz, the Light Hunter. Our scientists called it something else entirely." Tom remembered now. Fragments he'd buried so deep they felt like someone else's memories. The way the jungle had gone completely silent before their squad encountered it. The trees stripped bare in perfect circles, as if something had drained them of life. Rodriguez screaming about lights in the darkness before he'd simply vanished. "How many others knew?" Tom asked. "Your squad was the only ground team. Everyone else involved was either reassigned to black sites or suffered convenient accidents over the years. You disappeared so completely we assumed you were part of the cleanup." Through his window, Tom saw a flicker of movement near the barn. Just a shadow, but it moved wrong. Too fluid, too purposeful. "Morrison, if this thing is what I think it is, why would it come here? To me specifically?" "That's what worries me." Morrison's voice carried genuine fear now. The original specimen showed signs of advanced intelligence, pattern recognition. If it somehow tracked you down after 20 years... The phone line erupted in static. Tom pulled the device away from his ear, watching the display flicker between signal bars and dead air. When the interference cleared, Morrison's voice returned, urgent and strained. "Tom, Tom, are you there? I'm here. Listen to me. The extraction team won't reach you until tomorrow night at the earliest. You need to stay inside, keep all lights off after dark, and whatever you do, don't go near those trees again. What if it comes here, to the house? Pray it doesn't remember you as well as we think it does." The line went dead. Tom set the phone down with deliberate care and walked to his gun safe. His hands moved with muscle memory as he retrieved his old service rifle and began loading magazines with military precision. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting his cornfields in shades of amber and rust. He had perhaps 3 hours of daylight left. As he checked the rifle's action, Tom found himself remembering Rodriguez's final transmission before the static claimed him. "It's not hunting us, Sarge. It's studying us." The shadows outside his window seemed to pulse with patient alien intelligence. The shadows beneath the oak tree seemed deeper now, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Tom knelt beside the massive trunk, his weathered fingers tracing the gouges that had started this nightmare. 3 days had passed since he'd first noticed them, and they'd grown worse, longer, deeper, more deliberate. These weren't random scratches anymore. They formed patterns. His military training kicked in as he studied the markings, grid references, coordinates. Someone, or something, was leaving him a message. The first set of numbers led to a spot 12 miles northeast, deep in the state forest where he'd never had reason to venture. Tom's gut churned as he recognized the area from old topographical maps he'd studied during his deployment prep 30 years ago. That sector had been marked for geological surveys before his unit shipped out to Afghanistan, before everything went to hell, before Project Lazarus. The name hit him like ice water, dragging up memories he'd spent decades burying. Dr. Elena Vasquez with her cold eyes and colder experiments, the things they'd found in those caves, the things they'd brought back. Tom's satellite phone buzzed, a luxury he'd installed after Martha's death, though he rarely used it. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but when he answered, the voice was hauntingly familiar. "Hello, Thomas." His blood froze. Dr. Vasquez sounded exactly the same, as if 30 years hadn't passed, as if she hadn't died in that cave-in, along with half his unit. "You're dead," he whispered. Her laugh was soft, clinical. "Death is such a limiting concept, don't you think? I've learned to view it more as a temporary inconvenience." Tom's hand shook as he gripped the phone. "What do you want?" "I want you to follow the coordinates. You'll find them quite familiar. We use the same encryption methods I taught your unit. Some habits die hard," another laugh. "Though I suppose that's not entirely accurate anymore." The line went dead. Tom stared at the phone, his mind racing. Vasquez had been the lead scientist on their classified operation, studying what the locals had called the breathing caves, a network of underground chambers that seemed to pulse with their own life. The indigenous people had warned them to stay away, speaking in hushed tones about things that came back wrong, about the earth itself rejecting the dead. They should have listened. Instead, they'd gone deeper, following Vasquez's instruments and theories about geological anomalies. They'd found the pods, organic chambers embedded in the cave walls like massive eggs, and, inside them, things that had once been human. Things that remembered being human but were something else entirely. Project Lazarus had been shut down after the cave-in. Officially, it had never existed. The surviving members of his unit had been sworn to secrecy, given new identities, and scattered across the country. Tom had come here, to this remote farm, to forget, to live quietly until the memories faded. But memories didn't fade when they came looking for you. As evening approached, Tom loaded his truck with supplies, military surplus gear he'd kept just in case, night vision goggles, tactical vest, weapons he'd hoped never to use again. His arthritic hands moved with muscle memory, checking magazines and testing equipment with the efficiency of a man who'd done this countless times in hostile territory. The drive to the coordinates took him through increasingly dense forest, down logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance in years. His headlights carved tunnels through the darkness, illuminating the eyes of creatures that watched from the tree line. Too many eyes, too bright, too intelligent. The coordinates led to a clearing he remembered from satellite photos, 3 decades old. In the center stood a structure that hadn't been there before. A metal building, industrial and stark against the natural landscape. Light spilled from its windows, and the low hum of generators filled the night air. Tom parked at the clearing's edge and approached on foot. Through the windows he could see laboratories, computer banks, and figures moving with a jerky, unnatural gait of things that had forgotten how to be human. A sign by the entrance read, "Lazarus Research Station. Resurrection protocols active." Below it, in smaller text, "Welcome home, Sergeant Morrison." They'd been waiting for him. All these years, they'd been preparing for his return. The scratches on his oak tree hadn't been a threat. They'd been an invitation, a summons to finish what they'd started in those breathing caves so long ago. Tom checked his rifle one final time and stepped toward the entrance. Whatever Dr. Vasquez had become, whatever project Lazarus had evolved into during his decades of denial, it ended tonight. He'd run from his past long enough. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the smell that wafted out made his stomach revolt. Antiseptic mixed with decay, the scent of things that should be dead but weren't. From somewhere deep in the facility, Elena Vasquez called his name. The screaming started at 3:47 a.m. Tom bolted upright in bed, his hand instinctively reaching for the Colt. 45 he kept in the nightstand drawer. The sound cut through the darkness like a blade, high-pitched, inhuman, and coming from somewhere near the barn. He'd heard plenty of animals in distress over the years, but this was different. This carried an intelligence that made his skin crawl. Sarah stirred beside him, mumbling something about the television being too loud. She'd taken her sleeping pills again, thank God. Whatever was happening out there, she didn't need to be part of it. Tom pulled on his jeans and boots, grabbed his pistol and the heavy-duty flashlight from the closet shelf. The hardwood floor creaked under his weight as he made his way to the kitchen window. Outside, the motion sensor lights had triggered around the barn, casting harsh white circles that seemed to make the surrounding darkness even more impenetrable. The screaming had stopped, but now he could hear something else, a wet, rhythmic sound like meat being torn from bone. His hands were surprisingly steady as he checked the clip, 15 rounds. He'd faced down Taliban fighters with less ammunition, but those had been human enemies. Predictable. This felt different, and the rational part of his mind that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Afghanistan was screaming warnings he didn't want to acknowledge. The kitchen door opened with its familiar squeak. Tom stepped onto the porch, immediately hit by the smell, that same metallic stench from the oak tree, but stronger now, mixed with something else, something that reminded him of the field hospitals in Kandahar. He kept the flashlight off and let his eyes adjust to the darkness. The motion sensors had timed out, plunging the barn area back into shadow. Tom moved carefully across the yard, his boots silent on the dew-wet grass. 30 years of hunting had taught him how to move without sound, and his military training never really left. As he approached the barn, the smell intensified. The large sliding door stood partially open. He was certain he'd secured it before dinner. Through the gap, he could see a faint red glow emanating from inside, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. Tom pressed himself against the barn wall and peered through the gap. What he saw made his bladder nearly release. The interior of the barn had been transformed into something from a nightmare. The walls were covered in the same luminescent fungal growth he'd seen on the oak, but here it formed intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in his peripheral vision. The red glow emanated from clusters of bulbous pods hanging from the rafters like grotesque fruit. And there, in the center of it all, was what remained of his prize bull, Angus. The animal had been split open from sternum to pelvis, but it was still alive, still breathing. Its eyes tracked Tom's movement with an intelligence that cattle didn't possess, and when it opened its mouth, it wasn't a cow's lowing that emerged, but something that sounded almost like words in a language that hurt to hear. Standing over the mutilated animal was a figure that Tom's mind refused to properly process. It had the general shape of a man, but stood nearly 8 feet tall, its pale skin covered in the same bioluminescent patterns that decorated the walls. Its fingers, too long, too jointed, moved with surgical precision as they extracted something glowing from the bull's chest cavity. The thing looked up and saw him. Its face was human enough to be recognizable, but wrong enough to trigger every survival instinct Tom possessed. The features were elongated, the eyes too large and completely black, and when it smiled, revealing teeth like obsidian needles, Tom felt his sanity slip a notch. "Hello, Thomas," it said in a voice like grinding glass. "We've been waiting for you." Tom raised his pistol and fired 3 times in rapid succession. The bullet struck center mass, and the thing staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it tilted its head like a curious dog and made a sound that might have been laughter. Copper-jacketed lead. How quaint. The holes in its chest began closing, the pale flesh knitting together with wet sounds. "Did you really think conventional weapons would work on us? After everything you've seen?" Tom backed away from the barn, his mind racing. "Everything you've seen?" The words triggered a memory he'd spent years trying to suppress. A night mission in the Afghan mountains, a cave system that intelligence swore was empty. The things they'd found in the deepest chambers. "Project Nightfall," he whispered. The creature's smile widened. "He remembers. Good. That will make this so much more interesting." It took a step toward him, its movements fluid and predatory. "Did you think we'd forgotten about you, Thomas? About what your team did to our advanced scouts?" Tom turned and ran. The generator hummed to life, with a mechanical wheeze that made Tom's teeth ache. He'd positioned it behind the barn, hoping the sound wouldn't carry too far across the valley, but in the stillness of the evening, every vibration seemed amplified. The fluorescent work lights he'd rigged up cast harsh shadows across the farmyard, turning familiar shapes into something alien and threatening. Sarah emerged from the house carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her face pale in the artificial glare. "How long do you think the fuel will last?" "Maybe 8 hours if we're lucky." Tom accepted the mug gratefully, wrapping his weathered hands around the warmth. "I've got another 20 gallons in the shed, but after that?" He let the sentence hang between them. They stood in silence, listening to the generator's steady pulse. Beyond the circle of light, the darkness seemed absolute. Tom found himself straining to hear other sounds, the rustle of movement in the corn, the snap of a twig, anything that might signal they weren't alone. "Tell me about Kandahar," Sarah said quietly. Tom nearly dropped his coffee. "What? You were there in 09, right? You never talk about it, but I've seen the commendation letter, something about a biological weapons facility." The memories came rushing back like a physical blow. The compound hidden in the mountains, the smell of chemicals and decay, the things they'd found in those underground laboratories, things that had made hardened soldiers vomit and pray. "How did you?" "I'm not stupid, Tom. I've been putting pieces together since this morning." Sarah's voice was steady, but he could see the fear in her eyes. "Those scratches on the oak tree, they're not from any animal, are they?" Tom set down his mug and walked to the edge of the light. The corn rustled in a breeze he couldn't feel. "We thought we'd destroyed everything, burned it all to ash and called in airstrikes on what was left. But we were wrong. The admission tasted like bile. We found evidence of transport, shipping manifests, communication logs. Someone had moved samples before we arrived." A sound echoed across the farm, a low guttural call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Both Tom and Sarah froze, coffee forgotten. "They're coordinating," he said, more to himself than to Sarah. "Who? Who's coordinating?" Before Tom could answer, the generator coughed and sputtered. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied again. But in those brief moments of darkness, Tom saw something that made his blood freeze. Eyes, reflected in the dying light, at least 3 sets of them, positioned around the perimeter of the farmyard. Too high off the ground to be dogs or coyotes, too wide-set to be human. "Sarah," he said carefully, not taking his eyes off the spot where he'd seen the reflection. "I need you to go into the house. Right now." "What? Why?" "Go inside, lock the doors, and get my service pistol from the bedroom safe. The combination is your birthday." Sarah started to protest, but another sound cut her off, a wet, sliding noise like something heavy being dragged across gravel. It was coming from the direction of the barn. "They found me," he said simply. "After all these years, they finally found me." The generator shuddered again, and this time Tom could see the fuel gauge dropping faster than it should. Something was wrong with the engine, or maybe something had tampered with the fuel line. He grabbed Sarah's arm and started pulling her toward the house. "Listen to me very carefully. When I give the word, you run for the porch and don't look back. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, her face white with terror. The sliding sound grew louder, accompanied now by what could only be described as breathing, deep, labored respirations that seemed to come from multiple sources. Tom counted at least 4 distinct patterns, maybe more. "What are they?" Sarah asked. Tom thought about the files he'd seen, the photographs that had been classified beyond top secret, the experiments in genetic manipulation, the attempts to create perfect soldiers by combining human intelligence with predatory instincts, the subjects that had been deemed failures and supposedly terminated. "They're us," he said quietly, "or what we were supposed to become." The generator gave a final gasping cough and died. The lights went out all at once, plunging the farmyard into absolute darkness. In the silence that followed, Tom could hear them moving, circling, positioning themselves, preparing for something he'd hoped never to face again. "Run," he whispered, and then the night exploded into chaos. The radio crackled to life at 3:47 a.m., jarring Tom from his restless vigil by the kitchen window. Static filled the air before a voice broke through, his own voice, speaking words he'd never said. "Base, this is Harvest 1. Package delivered. Repeat, package delivered." Tom's blood turned to ice. He lunged for the radio, switching it off, but the transmission continued echoing from somewhere outside. The voice drifted through the walls, carried on the night wind, coming from the direction of the barn. He grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch. The motion sensors he'd installed earlier remained dark. Whatever was out there either wasn't moving or wasn't registering as alive. The thought sent shivers down his spine. The transmission repeated, his voice calling out coordinates he recognized from 20 years ago. Firebase Echo, the place where everything went wrong. Sarah appeared behind him, pulling on her jacket. "Tom, what?" "Stay inside." His voice was sharper than intended. "Lock the door. Don't come out no matter what you hear. I'm not leaving you out here alone with that thing." Before he could argue, the barn lights flickered on. Not the harsh fluorescence he'd installed, but a soft amber glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. Through the open doors, shadows moved, tall, angular shapes that defied the laws of physics. "Jesus Christ," Sarah whispered. Tom's military training kicked in. Whatever was in that barn had been studying them, learning from them. The radio transmissions, the mimicry. It wasn't random. Someone or something was using his past against him. They moved across the yard in a tactical formation Tom's body remembered, even if his mind resisted. Sarah stayed low behind him, her breathing controlled, despite the terror he could feel radiating from her. The closer they got to the barn, the more wrong everything felt. The air itself seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl. The radio transmission stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that made Tom's knees nearly buckle. Helicopters, the distinctive whoop, whoop, whoop of Blackhawks approaching fast, but when he looked up, the sky was empty. "Do you hear that?" Sarah's voice was barely audible. "Yeah." Tom's grip tightened on his rifle. "But there's nothing there." The phantom helicopter sounds grew louder, joined by voices shouting orders in the night. Tom recognized some of them. Sergeant Martinez, Lieutenant Cooper, men who died in the jungle 20 years ago. Their voices were calling his name, demanding to know why he'd left them behind. "Tom, We need to get out of here. Sarah tugged at his arm, but he couldn't move. The sounds were pulling him forward, dragging up memories he'd spent decades trying to bury. Inside the barn, the amber light pulsed faster. The shadows resolved into shapes that hurt to look at directly, tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to bend reality around them. They stood motionless, arranged in a perfect circle around something at the center of the barn floor. Tom forced himself to focus. Whatever these things were, they were using psychological warfare tactics against him. The sounds, the voices, the memories, all of it was designed to break him down, make him vulnerable. The question was why? Tom! Sarah's voice cut through the phantom noise. Look at the ground. He followed her gaze and felt his blood turn to slush. Footprints led from the barn to the house and back again, human footprints that matched his boots exactly. But the impressions were wrong, too deep in some places, too shallow in others, as if something had been studying how he walked and hadn't quite mastered the technique. How many times has it been in our house? Sarah's question hung in the air like a death sentence. Before Tom could answer, the phantom helicopter sounds reached a crescendo, and suddenly the barn fell silent. The amber light died, plunging everything into darkness. In that moment of absolute quiet, Tom heard something that made his soul recoil, the sound of his own breathing coming from inside the barn. Run! The word escaped his lips before conscious thought. Run now! They sprinted toward the house, but the motion sensors finally triggered, flooding the yard with harsh white light. Behind them, something emerged from the barn, a shape that moved like Tom but wrong, off-kilter, as if puppeteered by something that didn't understand human anatomy. Sarah reached the porch first, fumbling with the door. Tom spun around, raising his rifle, and found himself staring at his own face. The thing wore his features like an ill-fitting mask, his eyes blank and lifeless, his mouth moving in perfect sync with words Tom had spoken hours ago. Sarah, get inside. Lock the door. The creature's voice was his voice, but hearing it from outside his own throat was like listening to a recording of his own death. Tom squeezed the trigger, but the thing was already moving, flowing around the bullets like smoke, advancing with predatory patience. Behind him, Sarah screamed. The basement lab hummed with electric tension as Tom hunched over the microscope, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the focus. What he saw in the sample made his blood run cold. The cellular structure was unlike anything terrestrial, geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with their own alien rhythm, as if the very matter was alive and watching him back. Jesus Christ, he whispered, pulling away from the eyepiece. The implications crashed over him like a tide. 23 years ago in the mountains of Afghanistan, his unit had stumbled upon something that wasn't supposed to exist. They'd been told it was a weapons cache, but the metal fragments they'd recovered from that cave had been unlike anything in any military handbook. The memory surfaced with brutal clarity, the way the air had shimmered around those twisted metallic shards, how Sergeant Morrison had started speaking in languages that didn't exist, his eyes reflecting light like an animal's. Command had swept it under the rug, marked their reports classified, and scattered the unit to different bases. But they'd all carried pieces home, literally. Microscopic fragments embedded in their gear, their clothes, their skin. Tom's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, "We know you found it. Stop digging or join the others." His hands shook as he typed back, "What others?" The response came immediately. Morrison, Gutierrez, Chen, all dead. You're next unless you cooperate. The lights in the basement flickered, and Tom heard something that made his skin crawl. A sound like metal scraping against bone, coming from directly above him. Footsteps, but not human footsteps. These had too many beats, an irregular rhythm that his brain couldn't quite process. He grabbed the shotgun from the workbench and crept toward the stairs, each step deliberate and silent. The scraping sound moved across his kitchen floor, accompanied by what sounded like wet breathing. Through the basement door's crack, he could see a shadow passing back and forth, tall, impossibly tall, with appendages that bent at wrong angles. The thing was in his house. Tom's military training kicked in, overriding the primal terror that threatened to freeze him in place. He knew the layout of every room, every corner where he could take cover. But as he reached for the door handle, his phone buzzed again. "Look outside." Against every instinct, Tom moved to the small basement window and peered through the grime-covered glass. His farm was surrounded. Shapes moved in the darkness between the trees, humanoid but wrong, their movements too fluid, too purposeful. Some walked upright, others seemed to flow across the ground like liquid shadow. All of them were converging on his house. The scratching above stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that made Tom's teeth ache, a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate through his bones. Then came the voice, emanating from everywhere at once, speaking in Morrison's familiar drawl but with an underlying harmonic that spoke of vast spaces and impossible geometries. "Tom, old buddy, we've been waiting for you to find the breadcrumbs we left. Time to come home." "Morrison's dead," Tom called out, his voice steadier than he felt. "I went to his funeral." Laughter echoed through the house. Morrison's laugh, but layered with others. Gutierrez's wheeze, Chen's nervous giggle, voices of men who should be silent forever. "Death's just another kind of service, Tom. We're all still here, still following orders. New orders." The basement door creaked open, and something began descending the stairs. Tom raised the shotgun but hesitated when he saw it, or rather, saw what it had been. Morrison's face, still recognizable despite the metallic tendrils that had replaced his hair and the bioluminescent patches that pulsed along his neck. His uniform was the same one he'd died in, but it seemed to be partially fused with his flesh, the fabric breathing with his movements. "That cave in Afghanistan," Morrison said, his voice now purely his own, tinged with something that might have been regret. "It wasn't a weapons cache, Tom. It was a seed pod. We brought the seeds home, carried them in our blood, our dreams. They've been growing ever since, waiting for the right conditions to bloom." Tom's finger found the trigger. "What do you want?" "Integration, evolution. The same thing we all want, to serve something greater than ourselves." Morrison took another step down, and Tom could see that his feet weren't touching the stairs. He was floating, suspended by invisible forces. "You can fight and die badly, or you can join us and transcend everything you ever thought you knew about existence." The shapes outside were pressing against the windows now, their forms more visible in the moonlight. Tom recognized faces, neighbors, people from town, all bearing the same metallic modifications, the same luminescent patches. The infection had spread far beyond his unit. "How long?" Tom asked. 23 years of slow cultivation. But the harvest started 3 months ago. You're one of the last originals, Tom. Your resistance is stronger because you were there at the beginning. But resistance is futile." Morrison smiled, and his teeth gleamed like polished chrome. "Time to come home, soldier." The static from Tom's old ham radio crackled through the farmhouse kitchen as he hunched over the receiver, his weathered fingers dancing across the dials. 3 days had passed since he'd found the second set of marks, deeper gouges in the barn's wooden frame that made the oak tree scratches look like kitten claws. Sleep had become a luxury he couldn't afford. "Delta 77, this is Echo 49, do you copy?" Tom's voice was hoarse from exhaustion and too much coffee. Nothing but white noise answered him. He'd been trying to reach Marcus Chen for hours. Marcus was the only other surviving member of their unit from Operation Blackwater, the classified mission in Myanmar that officially never happened. If anyone would know what those marks really meant, it would be Marcus. The floorboards creaked behind him. Tom spun around, hand instinctively reaching for the Colt. 45 he'd started wearing again. But it was just Sarah, his daughter-in-law, standing in the doorway with concern etched across her face. "Tom, you need to get some rest. You look like hell." "Can't rest. Not yet." He turned back to the radio, adjusting the frequency. "Something's coming, Sarah. I can feel it in my bones." She moved closer, wrapping her arms around herself. "What kind of something? You've been talking in riddles for days." Tom hesitated. How could he explain without sounding like a madman? That during a covert operation 30 years ago, his unit had stumbled upon something in the Burmese jungle that wasn't supposed to exist, that they'd been sworn to secrecy about the creatures they'd encountered, things that moved like shadows and left marks exactly like the ones now appearing around his farm. "Where's Billy?" he asked instead, referring to his 10-year-old grandson. "Inside, playing video games." "Tom, you're scaring me." Before he could respond, a burst of static erupted from the radio, followed by a weak voice. "Echo 49. This is Delta 77. Barely copy." Tom lunged for the microphone. "Marcus! Marcus, is that you?" "Tom, thank God. Been trying to reach you for weeks." The signal was breaking up badly, but Tom could hear the terror in his old friend's voice. "Marcus, where are you? Are you seeing the marks too?" "They found me, Tom, in Sacramento. Killed my dog first. Then the neighbors started disappearing." Sarah grabbed Tom's arm. "What is he talking about?" Tom shushed her, straining to hear through the interference. "Marcus, are you safe? Where are you now?" "Gas station. Highway 50. They're hunting me. Been driving for 2 days. Tom, they remember us. After all these years, they remember." The radio went dead. Tom frantically worked the dials, trying to re-establish contact, but there was nothing. His hands were shaking as the full implications hit him. Marcus was running. That meant the things from Myanmar weren't just passing through, they were systematically tracking down everyone from their unit. "Tom, what the hell is going on?" Sarah's voice was sharp with fear. He stood slowly, his joints protesting. Through the kitchen window, he could see the sun setting behind the tree line, painting the sky blood red. Soon it would be dark, and that's when they would come. He was sure of it now. "We need to leave, tonight, right now." "Leave? This is your home, Tom. You were born in this house. And I'll die in it if we don't go." He moved to the window, scanning the shadows between the trees. "Pack only what you need. Food, water, warm clothes. We'll take the truck and head for the city. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's happening." Tom turned to face her, and Sarah stepped back at the haunted look in his eyes. 30 years ago, my unit encountered something in the jungle, something that wasn't supposed to exist. We killed several of them and we thought that was the end of it. But they're intelligent, Sarah, and they don't forget." A low sound drifted through the evening air, not quite a howl, not quite a roar, but something that made every primitive instinct in Tom's body scream danger. Sarah heard it too. Her face went pale. "What was that?" "That," Tom said, checking his pistol and grabbing the shotgun from above the fireplace, "was our cue to leave." He could see movement now in the tree line, shapes that flowed like liquid darkness between the trunks. They were still a quarter-mile away, but closing fast. "Get Billy, now. Don't let him see outside." Sarah ran for the living room while Tom quickly gathered supplies. As he stuffed ammunition into a duffel bag, he caught sight of an old photograph on the mantel, his unit in Myanmar, young and cocky, posing with their weapons. 6 men who thought they were invincible. Now only 2 remained. The sounds were getting closer. The creature's shriek still echoed in Tom's ears as he stumbled through the darkness, Sarah's hand gripping his arm like a vice. Behind them, the sound of splintering wood told him their barricade wouldn't hold much longer. The emergency radio crackled with static as they moved, Colonel Hayes's voice cutting through the interference. "Tom, respond. We've got movement on thermal, multiple contacts converging on your position. We're mobile." Tom gasped into the radio, pulling Sarah toward the back of the farmhouse. "How long until extraction?" 12 minutes. Can you hold?" Tom glanced back at the front door, which was now bowing inward with each impact. The creature's claws scraped against the wood with a sound like grinding metal. "Negative. We're compromised." He led Sarah through the kitchen, grabbing the tactical bag he'd prepared from the pantry. Inside were flares, ammunition, and something he'd hoped never to use again, a small metal cylinder marked with biohazard warnings, the emergency beacon from his Black Ops days, designed to call in a strike team when biological weapons were involved. "What is that thing?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as another crash shook the house. "Something that shouldn't exist," Tom replied, checking his rifle's magazine. "Something we created and thought we destroyed 20 years ago in the Kosovo labs." The front door finally gave way with a tremendous crack. Through the kitchen doorway, Tom caught a glimpse of the creature as it squeezed through the opening. In the dim light, its form was a nightmare amalgamation of human and something else entirely. Its elongated limbs moved with predatory grace, and its face, what had once been a face, was a twisted mass of scar tissue and bone protrusions. But the eyes, those burning yellow eyes, held an intelligence that made Tom's blood run cold. It had been human once, one of the test subjects from Project Lazarus. "Back door," he whispered, pushing Sarah ahead of him. They slipped outside into the night air, the familiar scent of his cornfields now tainted with the metallic smell of the creature's presence. The cornstalks rustled in the distance, and Tom realized with growing horror that the sounds weren't coming from the wind. There were more of them. His radio crackled again. "Tom, we're reading heat signatures throughout your property, at least 6 distinct contacts." 6. Tom's mind raced back to the classified files he'd buried in his memory. Project Lazarus had 12 subjects initially, but only 6 had survived the final phase of enhancement. The military had told him they'd been eliminated, their bodies incinerated. But standing in his cornfield, listening to inhuman sounds echoing from multiple directions, he knew that had been a lie. "The barn," he told Sarah, pointing toward the structure silhouetted against the starlight. "We can defend it better than out here in the open." They ran through his vegetable garden, Sarah's breathing labored as adrenaline and fear took their toll. Behind them, the creature emerged from the house, its head turning with mechanical precision as it tracked their scent. When it opened its mouth, the sound that emerged was no longer entirely animal. It spoke. "Tom, Collins." The words were distorted, stretched through vocal cords that had been surgically altered, but they were unmistakably his name. Sarah stumbled, looking back in terror. "It knows you," she gasped. "They all know me," Tom replied grimly. "I was their handler. Before the enhancements, they were soldiers under my command." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow, but there was no time to process it. More shapes emerged from the cornfield, moving with coordinated precision that spoke to their military training. These weren't mindless monsters. They were enhanced soldiers with 20 years of rage and a mission to complete. Tom kicked open the barn door and ushered Sarah inside, immediately moving to windows he'd prepared with firing positions. As he set up his rifle, he activated the emergency beacon. A soft blue light began pulsing on the device. "What does that do?" Sarah asked. "Calls in the cleanup crew," Tom replied, watching the creatures form a perimeter around the barn. "In 20 minutes, this entire area will be sterilized." "What does that mean?" Tom met her eyes, and she saw the terrible truth reflected there. "It means we have 20 minutes to either kill these things or find a way off this property, because when that strike team arrives, they won't distinguish between the targets and witnesses." The first creature, the one that had spoken his name, approached the barn door. In the moonlight streaming through the windows, Tom could see its face clearly now. Despite the horrific modifications, he recognized the bone structure, the way it held its shoulders. Sergeant Marcus Webb, a good soldier who'd volunteered for what they'd told him was an experimental medical treatment to help wounded veterans. Instead, they'd turned him into this abomination. "Marcus," Tom called out, "I know you can understand me." The creature's head tilted, and when it smiled, Tom saw rows of surgically implanted teeth designed for tearing flesh. The creature's shriek echoed through the barn as Tom's rifle shot found its mark, black ichor spraying across the hay bales. But instead of falling, the thing seemed to absorb the impact, its flesh rippling and reforming around the wound. The hole sealed itself with a wet, sucking sound that made Tom's stomach lurch. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, backing toward the ladder to the hayloft. The creature's eyes, too many eyes, scattered across what might have been its face, tracked his movement with predatory intelligence. Sarah's voice crackled through the radio clip to his belt. "Tom, we've got movement on the south perimeter. 3 more signatures heading your way." 3 more. Tom's mind raced as he climbed, the creature below him beginning to scale the barn wall with impossible ease. Its claws, the same claws that had marked the oak, dug deep furrows in the wooden planks. In the loft, Tom found what he was looking for. The old ammunition crate he'd hidden after returning from Afghanistan, the one containing the experimental rounds he'd been ordered to destroy but couldn't bring himself to discard. Insurance, he'd told himself then. Now that insurance might be the only thing standing between him and whatever nightmare the government had unleashed. The creature's head appeared over the edge of the loft floor, and Tom got his first clear look at it. The thing that had once been human, he was certain now it had been human, bore traces of military gear fused into its flesh. Dog tags hung from what remained of its neck, the metal partially absorbed into the writhing black tissue. Tom loaded one of the experimental rounds, a tungsten core bullet designed to penetrate enhanced armor, the kind of armor they'd been testing on volunteers in the Black Site program he'd been part of, the program that had supposedly been shut down. The shot took the creature in what passed for its chest, and this time the impact was different. The thing let out an otherworldly wail and stumbled backward, its form flickering like a bad television signal. For a moment, Tom could see through the horror to the man underneath, young, maybe 25, with the 1,000-yard stare Tom recognized from his own mirror. "I'm sorry," Tom whispered, and fired again. The creature collapsed, its form slowly deflating like a punctured balloon. But even as it died, Tom could hear the others approaching. The barn doors exploded inward, and 2 more nightmares poured through the opening. Tom dropped through the loft floor, landing hard on a pile of feed sacks. His radio squawked as he rolled to his feet, Sarah's voice tight with fear. "Tom, there's something else. I'm reading massive electromagnetic interference from the direction of the old Morrison place. Whatever's happening there, it's big." The Morrison place. Tom's blood went cold. The abandoned farm 3 miles north had been empty for years, ever since old Pete Morrison died, and his family couldn't sell the land. It would be the perfect staging ground for a covert operation. One of the creatures lunged at him, and Tom barely managed to get his rifle up in time. The impact sent him sprawling, but also gave him a clear shot at the thing's center mass. The experimental round punched through it like tissue paper, and the creature dissolved into steaming black fluid. The remaining creature paused, tilting its malformed head as if listening to something Tom couldn't hear. Then it did something that chilled him to the bone. It spoke. "Tom, Reeves." The voice was like gravel in a blender, barely recognizable as human. "Project Lazarus. Come. Home. Project Lazarus." The name hit Tom like a physical blow. He'd heard it whispered in the halls of the facility where they'd taken him after his capture, where they'd done things to him he'd spent years trying to forget. The project had been theoretical then, something about cellular regeneration and battlefield recovery. But if they'd actually implemented it— Tom raised his rifle, but the creature was already moving, impossibly fast. It crashed into him, driving him back against the barn wall. Up close, he could smell the decay, the wrongness that emanated from its flesh. But underneath that was something else. The familiar scent of military-issue soap and boot polish. "Who were you?" Tom gasped, struggling against the thing's grip. "Before they did this to you—" The creature's grip loosened slightly, confusion flickering across its features. For a moment, Tom saw the man again, clearer this time. Young, scared, wearing the uniform of someone who'd trusted his government to do right by him. Tom drove the butt of his rifle up into the thing's head, buying himself enough space to get the barrel between them. "I'll make sure they pay for what they did to you," he promised, and pulled the trigger. The creature crumpled, and sudden silence filled the barn. But Tom knew it was temporary. Sarah had mentioned 3 signatures, and he'd only dealt with 2. Somewhere out there, the 3rd was waiting. And beyond that, at the Morrison place, something much worse was beginning to stir. The creature's eyes reflected the moonlight like molten silver as it circled the barn. testing the barriers Tom had hastily erected. Each footstep sent tremors through the ground, and Tom could feel his heart hammering against his ribs as he crouched behind an overturned tractor. Sarah pressed close beside him. "The electromagnetic pulse won't hold it much longer," she whispered, her breath hot against his ear. "The field generator is already overheating." Tom watched the hulking shadow pause near the barn's eastern wall, its massive head tilting as if listening to something beyond human perception. In the pale light he could see the patches where its original fur had given way to metallic scales, the grotesque fusion of organic tissue and alien technology that had once been his fellow soldier, Marcus Chen. "Chen," Tom called out, his voice carrying across the farmyard. "I know you're still in there somewhere. You saved my life in Kandahar. Don't let them use you to take it now." The creature froze, and for a moment Tom thought he saw something flicker across its distorted features, a flash of recognition, perhaps even pain. But then it threw back its head and released a sound that was neither human scream nor animal roar, but something far worse, the electronic shriek of machinery grinding against bone. The barn's metal walls began to vibrate, and sparks showered from the field generator Sarah had cobbled together from farm equipment and military hardware Tom had hoped never to use again. The electromagnetic barrier wavered, creating gaps in the protective field. "Move," Tom hissed, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her toward the farmhouse. Behind them, the creature, what Chen had become, smashed through the failing barrier like tissue paper. They reached the porch just as the thing rounded the barn, moving with impossible speed despite its size. Tom slammed the reinforced door behind them and threw the deadbolt, knowing it would buy them perhaps 30 seconds at most. "The basement," Sarah gasped, pointing toward the kitchen. "The Faraday cage you built down there. It might disrupt their control signal." Tom nodded, but as they rushed through the darkened house, he caught sight of movement outside the living room window, more shapes moving through the darkness, converging on the farmhouse from multiple directions. His blood ran cold as he recognized the distinctive gait of another transformed soldier, then another. "They sent the whole unit," he breathed. "Everyone who was exposed in that cave." The front door exploded inward with a sound like thunder, sending splinters of reinforced wood across the entryway. Tom pushed Sarah ahead of him toward the basement stairs just as Chen's massive form filled the doorway, his transformed bulk scraping against the frame. In the basement, Tom's hands flew over the control panel he'd installed years ago, activating systems he'd prayed he'd never need. The Faraday cage hummed to life, electromagnetic fields crackling between the copper mesh embedded in the walls. Above them, heavy footsteps shook dust from the ceiling beams. "Tom," Sarah's voice was tight with fear as she monitored the readings on her tablet. "The signal isn't just controlling them, it's changing them, continuing the transformation. The metallic components are spreading through their nervous systems in real time." A new sound echoed through the house, the scrape of claws against hardwood, followed by another voice Tom recognized with sick certainty. "Tommy." The word was barely recognizable, distorted by vocal cords that were no longer entirely human. "Tommy, we know you're here. We followed your scent for 300 miles. It was Rodriguez, or what had been Rodriguez. Tom closed his eyes, remembering the young sergeant's easy laugh, his pictures of the daughter he'd never see grow up. "They want something from you," Sarah whispered, studying the electromagnetic readings. "The signal intensity spikes whenever they get near you specifically. This isn't random. You're the target." Tom's hand moved instinctively to the scar on his chest, the mark left by shrapnel from the cave explosion. The cave where they'd found the artifact, where everything had started to go wrong. "The metal fragment," he said slowly. "The one the doctors couldn't remove. It wasn't shrapnel from our explosives." The basement ceiling groaned under increasing weight as more of the transformed soldiers gathered in the house above. Tom could hear them moving with purpose now, systematic and coordinated in a way that spoke of shared consciousness. Sarah's tablet screen flickered as she ran another scan. "Tom, that fragment, it's not just metal, it's broadcasting something, a beacon. The truth hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just a witness to what had happened in that Afghan cave. He was the key, the carrier of some alien technology that had been waiting dormant in his chest for 15 years. And now they had come to collect it. The basement door splintered above them, and the sound of descending footsteps filled the narrow stairwell, multiple sets, heavy and deliberate. Tom's finger hovered over the final switch on his control panel, the one he'd hoped never to use. The screaming from the farmhouse cut through the night like a blade through silk. Tom's blood turned to ice as Sarah's voice carried across the fields, raw with terror and pain. The creature beside him let out a guttural roar, its massive form already turning toward the sound. "No," Tom whispered, then louder. "No." His legs carried him faster than they had in 20 years, muscles burning as he sprinted across the uneven ground. Behind him, inhuman sounds echoed through the darkness. The other subjects were moving, drawn by the commotion like moths to flame. The farmhouse windows glowed yellow in the distance, but something was wrong with the light. It flickered and danced in ways that electric bulbs never should. Tom burst through the kitchen door to find chaos. The table was overturned, chairs scattered like broken bones. Sarah's coffee mug lay in pieces across the linoleum, dark liquid spreading in an expanding pool. But it wasn't coffee. The metallic smell hit him immediately. "Sarah!" His voice cracked as he called out, following the trail of destruction through the hallway. Pictures had been torn from the walls, their glass faces reflecting the strange, pulsing light that seemed to emanate from upstairs. The stairs creaked under his weight as he climbed, each step deliberate despite his racing heart. Years of military training warred with panic, creating a strange calm that settled over him like a familiar coat. His hand found the service pistol at his belt, though he knew it would be useless against what he might find. The master bedroom door hung off its hinges, splintered wood scattered across the carpet. Inside, Sarah knelt in the corner, her back pressed against the wall, eyes wide with a terror so complete it seemed to have paralyzed her vocal cords. She was unhurt. Tom could see that immediately, but whatever she had witnessed had carved itself into her features like acid on stone. "Where is it?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's mouth moved silently before any sound emerged. "The window," she finally managed. It came through the window. Tom turned to see the bedroom's large picture window completely gone, not just broken but removed entirely. Glass littered the floor in a perfect circle around where the frame had been, as if something had carefully extracted the entire pane before entering. The curtains fluttered in the night breeze, and beyond them, the cornfield stretched into impenetrable darkness. What did it look like? Tom knelt beside his wife, checking her for injuries while keeping his eyes on the window. "Like," Sarah's voice hitched, "like Danny." It looked like Danny, but wrong. All wrong. His eyes were black, completely black, and his skin was grey like old meat. And the smell, Tom, it smelled like the basement of the old morgue in town, but worse. Tom's stomach lurched. Danny Morrison, their neighbour's boy who had disappeared 3 months ago during a camping trip. The search had gone on for weeks, before the authorities finally gave up, declaring it a tragic accident, despite never finding a body. But Tom knew better now. Danny hadn't died in those woods. He had been taken. A sound from downstairs made them both freeze. The slow scrape of claws against wood, deliberate and patient. Whatever had taken Danny was back, and it wasn't alone. "The closet," Tom whispered urgently, helping Sarah to her feet. "Get in the closet and don't come out until I tell you. I'm not leaving you." "This isn't a discussion." Tom's tone carried the authority of his former rank. "They're here for me, not you. But if something happens—" He pressed his backup pistol into her trembling hands. "Aim for the head and keep pulling the trigger until it stops moving." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded and disappeared into the walk-in closet, pulling the door shut behind her. Tom heard the soft click of the lock engaging. The scraping sound grew closer, accompanied now by a wet, rhythmic breathing that seemed to echo from multiple sources. Tom positioned himself beside the destroyed window, using the wall for cover while keeping a clear view of the bedroom entrance. Minutes passed in agonizing silence before the first shape appeared in the doorway. It might have been human once, but the transformation had warped it into something else entirely. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in directions that defied anatomy. The face was the worst part, recognizably human features stretched and distorted like a photograph left too long in the sun. But it was the eyes that confirmed Tom's worst fears. Those black, empty sockets had once belonged to Marcus Chen, a young private who had served under him in Afghanistan. A good kid with a quick smile and an infectious laugh, now reduced to this shambling horror. More shapes gathered behind Marcus, filling the doorway with their twisted forms. Tom counted at least 6, though it was difficult to tell where one ended and another began in the dim light. They moved with purpose, surrounding him with the tactical precision he had once taught them. Project Lazarus had succeeded beyond the military's wildest dreams, but the cost was becoming horrifyingly clear. The underground facility stretched deeper than Tom had imagined, its sterile corridors branching like the root system of some mechanical tree. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, and the air recycling system wheezed with mechanical death rattles. Sarah moved beside him, her rifle trained ahead while Marcus brought up the rear, his breathing labored from the shoulder wound. "How much further?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant rumble of machinery. Tom consulted the facility map he'd memorized years ago during his classified briefings. Central lab should be 2 levels down. If Dr. Kowalski is anywhere, that's where we'll find her. They descended through a maintenance stairwell, stepping over debris and broken glass. The walls were scarred with claw marks, deep gouges that spoke of desperate creatures trying to escape their metal prison. Tom's stomach lurched as he recognized the pattern. He'd seen similar marks on his oak tree, but these were fresh, still bearing traces of organic matter. The stairwell opened onto a vast laboratory floor. Banks of computers hummed in the darkness, their screens flickering with data streams and biometric readings. Containment units lined the walls, most empty now, their reinforced doors hanging open like broken jaws. But it wasn't the technology that made Tom's blood freeze. It was the bodies. At least a dozen corpses in lab coats were scattered across the floor, their remains bearing the unmistakable signs of the creature's feeding habits. Some had been partially consumed, others simply torn apart with surgical precision. The metallic scent of blood mixed with antiseptic created a nauseating cocktail that made Marcus gag. "Jesus Christ," Sarah breathed, stepping carefully around a severed arm. "What happened here?" A weak voice called from the far end of the lab. They evolved." Dr. Elena Kowalski emerged from behind an overturned desk, her white coat stained with blood and her usually pristine appearance disheveled. She clutched a tablet to her chest like a shield, her eyes wide with the 1,000-yard stare Tom recognized from too many battlefield medics. "Dr. Kowalski." Tom approached slowly, keeping his weapon lowered. "Are you injured?" She shook her head, though a thin cut across her forehead suggested otherwise. The specimens, they weren't just adapting to hunt humans. They were learning, communicating. She held up the tablet, its screen showing complex neural pathway diagrams. Their brain activity increased exponentially over the past 72 hours. They developed problem-solving, abilities, tactical thinking. Sarah glanced at Tom. "That's why they've been so coordinated in their attacks." "More than that," Kowalski continued, her voice gaining strength as she fell into scientist mode. "They've been selectively targeting individuals with specific genetic markers. Military personnel, law enforcement, anyone with combat training." She looked directly at Tom. "They're eliminating threats to their expansion." Marcus leaned heavily against a lab table, his face pale. "How many got out?" "Initial breach released 12 specimens, but they've been reproducing isn't the right word. Replicating, maybe. Each time they feed, They can split into multiple entities while retaining shared intelligence. Kowalski's hands trembled as she spoke. Conservative estimates suggest there could be 50 or more by now. I've been working on a targeted electromagnetic pulse that could disrupt their neural functions. The metallic components in their engineered biology make them vulnerable to specific frequencies. She gestured toward a complex device on a nearby table, its surface covered in blinking lights and exposed circuitry. But it would need to be deployed from the facility's transmission array on the surface level. The communication tower, Tom realized. It's designed to broadcast across a 50-mile radius. A distant sound echoed through the facility, the scraping of claws against metal growing closer. Sarah immediately moved to the lab's entrance, peering down the corridor they'd just traveled. "We've got company," she hissed. "Multiple contacts, moving fast." Kowalski grabbed the EMP device, struggling with its weight. "The transmission codes are in my office upstairs. But if those things are between us and the tower—" Tom made the calculation quickly. The creatures had found them, probably drawn by their scent or heat signatures. They had minutes, maybe less, before being overrun. The facility's layout offered few escape routes, and carrying the device would slow them down significantly. "There's another way," he said, remembering the building's schematics. "Emergency shaft leads directly to the surface, bypasses the main corridors entirely. It's narrow, but we can make it." The scraping sounds grew louder, accompanied now by the distinctive chittering communication the creatures used. Sarah backed away from the entrance, her finger tight on the trigger. "Whatever we're doing, we need to do it now," she said. Tom shouldered his rifle and moved toward Kowalski. "Can you carry that device?" She nodded grimly. "I'd rather die trying than live knowing I could have stopped them." The first creature appeared in the doorway just as they reached the emergency shaft, its eyeless head turning toward them with predatory focus. The explosion that rocked the farmhouse sent Tom sprawling across the kitchen floor, his ears ringing as plaster dust rained down from the ceiling. Through the shattered window, he could see the barn engulfed in flames, the orange glow casting dancing shadows across the yard. Sarah's scream cut through the chaos as she pulled herself up from behind the overturned table. "The specimens," Dr. Chen gasped, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. They were in the barn. Tom's blood ran cold. If the creatures had been released in the explosion, there was nowhere left to run. The communication array they'd been trying to reach lay in smoldering ruins, along with any hope of calling for military backup. A guttural roar echoed across the property, followed by another, then another. The sounds were different now, more primal, more enraged. The fire seemed to have driven them into a frenzy. "The root cellar," Tom said, helping Sarah to her feet. "It's our only chance." They stumbled through the house as the windows began exploding one by one, the heat from the barn fire creating a hellish backdraft. Tom grabbed his rifle and the remaining ammunition while Dr. Chen clutched her tablet, somehow still functional despite the chaos. Outside, the night had become a nightmare landscape. The creatures moved like liquid darkness between the flames, their forms more visible now in the firelight. Tom counted at least 6 of them, possibly more. Their bioluminescent markings pulsed in patterns that seemed almost like communication. "They're coordinating," Dr. Chen whispered as they crouched by the back door. "The neural modifications, they're working together now." Tom watched as 2 of the creatures flanked around the burning barn, while others took positions near the house. It was a tactical formation he recognized from his own military training. Whatever these things had once been, they retained enough human intelligence to wage war. Sarah gripped his arm. "The cellar entrance is 40 yards. Think we can make it?" Before Tom could answer, one of the creatures appeared at the kitchen window. Up close, Tom could see the horror of what the experiments had created, elongated limbs that ended in razor-sharp claws, eyes that glowed with predatory intelligence, and beneath the biomechanical modifications, traces of what had once been human features. "Run," he breathed. They burst through the back door as the window exploded inward. Tom fired 3 shots over his shoulder without looking back. Hearing an inhuman shriek that might have been pain or rage, the root cellar entrance lay ahead, a weathered wooden door set into the earth near Sarah's vegetable garden. "Tom, come on!" Sarah's voice echoed from below. He squeezed off his last 3 rounds and dove through the doorway, pulling the heavy wooden door shut just as claws raked across its surface. The ancient iron bolt slid home with a satisfying click, but Tom knew it wouldn't hold them for long. The cellar was cramped and musty, filled with preserved goods and old farming equipment. Sarah had found an oil lamp and was struggling to light it with shaking hands. Above them, they could hear the creatures moving across the cellar door, testing its strength. "There's another way out," Tom said, moving to the far corner where a narrow tunnel led toward the house's foundation. "Emergency exit. Dug it myself during the Cold War." Dr. Chen looked up from her tablet, which was somehow still receiving data. "The satellite feed shows more movement in the woods. Whatever signal they sent before the barn exploded, I think it was a distress call." "More of them?" Sarah asked. "No," Dr. Chen said grimly. "Something else. The thermal signatures are different, bigger." The scraping sounds above them intensified, and splinters of wood began raining down. Tom checked his ammunition. 2 spare magazines left. Not nearly enough if they were about to face whatever Dr. Chen had detected in the woods. A sound like tearing metal echoed through the cellar as one of the creature's claws punched through the door. Sarah moved closer to Tom, her face pale in the lamplight. "The tunnel leads to the old storm drain," Tom said. "From there we can reach the county road." "And then what?" Sarah asked. Tom looked at the hole growing larger in the cellar door, at Dr. Chen's grim expression as she monitored whatever was approaching through the woods, and at his wife's frightened but determined face. "Then we find out just how far this thing has spread," he said. The creature's screech cut through the night like a blade through bone, and Tom knew his time was up. The thing that had once been Sarah Matthews stood at the edge of his property line, her elongated limbs catching moonlight as she moved with predatory grace toward his farmhouse. Behind her, shadows shifted and writhed, more of them, emerging from the woods like nightmares given form. Tom's hands shook as he checked his rifle one last time. 3 rounds left. The military-grade ammunition he'd been hoarding since his discharge 20 years ago felt pathetically inadequate now. He'd seen what these things could do, how they absorbed bullets like raindrops, healing almost instantly from wounds that should have dropped them permanently. The radio crackled to life on his kitchen table. "Tom, you copy?" Dr. Reeves's voice was strained, desperate. "The containment protocol failed. They're everywhere now. The whole valley is compromised." Tom keyed the handset, keeping his eyes on the approaching figures. "Copy that, Doc. How many got out?" "All of them. The specimen you brought me, it wasn't just infected, it was a vector. Some kind of communication device. When I began the analysis, it sent out a signal. Every person who'd been exposed to the original pathogen began changing simultaneously." The farmhouse windows rattled as something massive struck the side wall. Tom moved away from the kitchen, rifle raised, backing toward the basement stairs. "What about the source, the military facility?" "Gone. Bombed 12 hours ago, but it doesn't matter now. The infection has evolved beyond anything they created in those labs. It's not just transforming human physiology anymore. It's rewriting genetic structure at the cellular level, creating something entirely new." Another impact shook the house, this time accompanied by the sound of splintering wood. Tom reached the basement door and paused. Down there waited his last resort, enough C4 to level half the property. He'd rigged it years ago, a paranoid precaution from a soldier who'd seen too much and trusted too little. "Tom," Dr. Reeves continued, her voice breaking with static, "I need you to understand something. Your exposure to the original pathogen during your service, it didn't just give you immunity, it made you a key. Your genetic markers, they're what these things need to complete their final transformation. They're not trying to kill you, they're coming to harvest you." The front door exploded inward, and Sarah's twisted form filled the doorway. What had once been her face was now a nightmare of exposed bone and cartilage, her jaw unhinged like a snake's. But her eyes, Christ, her eyes were still human, still aware, trapped inside the horror she'd become. "Tom," she spoke, her voice a wet rasp that somehow retained traces of the woman who used to sell him eggs at the farmer's market. "Come with us. Make it stop hurting." More shapes crowded behind her, neighbors, the mailman, children from the school bus that passed his farm each morning, all transformed, all wrong, but all undeniably still themselves in some fundamental, terrible way. Tom descended 2 steps into the basement, keeping the rifle trained on the creatures. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I should have recognized the signs sooner, should have warned everyone." She tilted her head, the gesture almost peaceful despite her monstrous appearance. "Not your fault." The hunger came so slowly, like being warm on a cold day, then burning from the inside out. "We tried to fight it, but fighting just made it worse." The other creatures began filing into his house, moving with coordinated purpose. They weren't attacking, they were surrounding, corralling him towards some predetermined outcome. Tom realized they'd been herding him all along, ever since that first night when he'd found the marks on his oak tree. "The tree," he said, understanding flooding through him. "You marked it as a beacon. You've been watching me for weeks." "Months," Sarah corrected. "Since the first dreams started, since we began changing. We could smell you, Tom, smell what you carried in your blood, what we need." Tom backed further down the stairs, his finger hovering over the detonator in his jacket pocket. The basement was dark, cramped, lined with shelves of preserves and emergency supplies, and wired with enough explosive to turn everything in a 50-yard radius into smoking crater. "If I give you what you want," he asked, "what happens to everyone else? To the world?" Sarah's ruined features attempted something like a smile. "Evolution, Tom. No more fear, no more isolation, just unity. Perfect, eternal unity." The creatures began descending the stairs, their movements synchronized like parts of a single organism. Tom's thumb found the detonator switch, felt the small safety cap that protected it from accidental activation. Above them, more sounds echoed through the house. Vehicles approaching, helicopters in the distance. The military cleanup crew arriving exactly as he'd expected they would. Right on schedule for the final act of a play that had been written decades ago in the classified halls of a facility that no longer existed. Tom closed his eyes, whispered a prayer for forgiveness, and made his choice. The creature's dying shriek echoed across the farm as Tom pulled the trigger one final time. The modified rifle bucked in his hands, the experimental ammunition, salvaged from his old military cache, finally proving effective. The thing that had once been Project Lazarus collapsed into the mud, its grotesque form twitching before going still. Tom's hands trembled as he lowered the weapon. 23 years since he'd walked away from the program, buried his uniform, and tried to forget what they'd created in those underground labs. He'd thought the files were destroyed, the specimens terminated, the whole nightmare sealed away forever. Sarah emerged from the barn, her face pale in the moonlight. "Is it over?" Tom nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the creature. Even in death it seemed wrong, too large, too angular, with that sickly luminescence still fading from its skin. "This one's dead. But Sarah—" He turned to face his daughter, seeing her mother's strength in her set jaw. "There might be others." The wind carried the acrid smell of the creature's blood across the farmyard. Tom's radio crackled with static. Then Dr. Helena Voss's voice cut through. "Tom, respond. We're tracking multiple heat signatures converging on your location." He grabbed the radio. "How many?" "At least 6. Maybe more. They're moving fast through the forest, coming from the northwest. You've got maybe 10 minutes." Tom's mind raced through their options. The farmhouse was defensible, but not against multiple creatures. The root cellar would be a death trap. His truck might get them to town, but these things could outrun most vehicles. "The old mine shaft," Sarah said suddenly. behind Miller's Ridge. It's too narrow for those things to follow us down, and it connects to the abandoned railway tunnel. We could get all the way to the main road underground." Tom stared at his daughter with new respect. She'd inherited more than her mother's strength. She had tactical instincts that would have impressed his old unit commander. "That's 3 miles through rough terrain in the dark. Better than waiting here to die." Dr. Voss's voice crackled again. "Tom, I'm reading massive electromagnetic interference. Something's jamming our satellites. Whatever created these things, it doesn't want us tracking them." The implications hit Tom like a physical blow. This wasn't just about escaped specimens or failed containment. Someone was actively controlling this situation, using the creatures as weapons. The scratches on his oak tree hadn't been random. They'd been a message, a warning that his past had finally found him. "Who else knew about Lazarus?" he asked into the radio as he and Sarah gathered supplies from the house. The project was compartmentalized. Maybe a dozen people had full access to the genetic templates. Most are dead now. Natural causes, accidents, a few suicides. But Tom, 3 of them work for Blackwater Genomics. The name made Tom's blood run cold. Blackwater had emerged from the military-industrial complex after the program's official termination, promising to use biotechnology for humanitarian purposes. If they'd gotten hold of the Lazarus protocols, a howl echoed from the forest, answered by another, then another. The pack was closing in. "We go now," Tom said, shouldering his pack and checking his remaining ammunition. 16 rounds left, not nearly enough. They slipped out through the kitchen door, moving low across the yard. The creature's calls were closer now, a haunting sound that raised every primitive instinct in Tom's nervous system. As they reached the tree line, he caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision. Something large and pale shifting between the oaks where this whole nightmare had started. The climb up Miller's Ridge tested every muscle in Tom's 60-year-old body, but Sarah moved with the sure-footed grace of someone who'd explored these hills since childhood. Behind them, the farm lights flickered and went dark. The creatures had reached the house. At the ridge's crest, they could see the mine entrance, a black mouth in the limestone cliff face. Tom had explored it as a boy, back when the old railroad still ran through the valley. The shaft dropped 40 feet straight down before leveling into the tunnel system. There were handholds carved into the rock, but the climb would be treacherous in the dark. Sarah was already rigging a rope around a sturdy pine. "I'll go first," she said. "Test the route." "No, I go first. If something happens, Dad." She gripped his shoulder. "I need you to survive this. You're the only one who knows how to stop them permanently." Before he could argue, she was over the edge, disappearing into the shaft. Tom counted her handholds, timing her descent. When the rope went slack, her voice echoed up, "Clear, come down." As Tom prepared to follow, Dr. Voss's voice whispered through the radio one last time. "Tom, I found something in the Blackwater files. Project Lazarus wasn't terminated, it was privatized. And according to this, you were never supposed to survive long enough to talk about it." The howls were getting closer.